10 silver coins for a broken Omega, anyone? The auctioneer's voice rang out across the stone hall, sharp and echoing. But no one answered, not even a whisper of interest, and Emily Carter kept her eyes fixed on the cold floor beneath her knees, as if the cracks in the stone could swallow her whole, because it was easier than seeing the truth in their faces, easier than watching them look at her and decide she was nothing, less than nothing, a mistake the moon had forgotten to erase, and the wooden tag hanging from her neck brushed against her chest with every shallow breath, the word rejected carved deep into its surface like it belonged there, like it had always been her name. And around her the air smelled of polished metal and expensive coats, of power and indifference, while the other Omegas stood straighter on the raised platform, their shoulders squared, their eyes bright with desperate hope, hope that someone, anyone, might choose them. But Emily had already learned what hope cost, had already paid for it in silence and long nights staring at a ceiling that never answered back. And when the auctioneer called another name, coins clinked, voices rose, decisions were made in seconds, lives traded like commodities measured in dollars and status. But when it was her turn again, the silence returned heavier than before, pressing against her ribs until her lungs struggled to expand, until even breathing felt like asking for too much. And somewhere to her left a younger Omega trembled, her hands shaking so badly the chains at her wrists rattled softly, a fragile sound swallowed by the crowd. And without thinking, Emily shifted slightly, just enough for her shoulder to brush the girl's, just enough to ground her, to steady the frantic rhythm of another's fear even as her own threatened to unravel. Because that was all she had ever been good for. Small quiet acts no one noticed, no one valued, and the auctioneer sighed, impatience creeping into his tone as he lifted his gavel again. Last call, he said, drawing out the words like a final verdict. No bids means she goes to processing. And a ripple of murmurs spread through the room, not cruel exactly, but detached, like people discussing weather instead of a life about to disappear. And Emily swallowed, her throat dry, her pulse loud in her ears, because she knew what processing meant, knew there would be no coming back from it, no second chance, no hidden miracle waiting beyond the next door. And for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to look up, to scan the sea of faces, searching for something, anything, that might prove she had been wrong about the world. But all she found were turned heads, bored expressions, eyes that slid past her like she wasn't even there, and the weight of it settled deep in her chest, cold and final, until the auctioneer lifted the gavel higher, and the room seemed to hold its breath. And then, just as the sound was about to fall, the massive doors at the far end of the hall opened with a low, resonant creak that cut through the silence like a line drawn in stone, and every head turned at once, every whisper died. And Emily felt it before she saw him, a shift in the air, a presence that pressed against her skin like a sudden drop in temperature, like standing too close to something powerful and not fully understood. And when her gaze followed the others, lifting slowly despite herself, she saw the figure standing in the doorway, tall, still, wrapped in quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. And for the first time since she had been brought into that room, the silence felt different, not empty, but waiting. The sound of the doors closing behind him seemed to seal the entire hall in place, as if the world itself had decided to stop and watch. And Emily felt it ripple through the crowd before she even dared to breathe again. The subtle shift from idle curiosity to something sharper, something edged with caution, because everyone knew who stood at that threshold even without an announcement, even without a name spoken aloud. And the auctioneer's confident posture faltered for the briefest second, his hand lowering just enough to betray uncertainty before he quickly straightened, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, voice dipping with forced ease. "We were not informed of your arrival." But the man in the doorway did not respond, did not acknowledge the greeting, and that silence carried more weight than any words could have, pressing down on every person in the room until even the faintest movement felt too loud, and Emily's heart stumbled against her ribs, an uneven rhythm she could not control, because she could feel him now in a way she could not explain, not through sight, not through sound, but something deeper, something instinctive that stirred beneath her skin like a forgotten memory waking up, and she did not understand it, did not trust it, but she could not ignore it either. And when he finally stepped forward, the sound of his boots against the stone floor echoed slowly, deliberately, each step measured in a way that made the distance between them feel both too long and far too short at the same time. And the crowd parted without being told, bodies shifting aside as if pulled by an invisible force, leaving a clear path straight toward the platform where she knelt, and Emily's fingers curled slightly against the ground, her breath catching as she fought the urge to lower her gaze again, because something in her resisted that instinct, something quiet but firm that refused to disappear this time. And when his presence drew closer, the air seemed to change, cooler, sharper, carrying a faint scent of pine and winter air that did not belong inside a closed hall. And it wrapped around her senses until everything else faded into the background, until the whispers, the murmurs, the weight of judgment all blurred into something distant and unimportant. And then he stopped, not at the center of the platform where the others stood waiting, but directly in front of her, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching thin as a thread, and Emily could feel the attention of every person in the room pressing down on her shoulders, waiting for her to shrink, to bow, to confirm what they already believed about her. But instead her head lifted, just slightly, just enough for her eyes to meet his, and the impact of it stole the air from her lungs, because his gaze was not what she expected. There was no dismissal there, no cold calculation, weighing her worth against a number, only a steady, unreadable focus that held her in place as if he had been looking for something and had finally found it. And the auctioneer cleared his throat, the sound awkward in the heavy quiet. "This one is unclaimed, Your Majesty," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "Defective, no scent, no value. We were about to remove her." And the words should have stung, should have cut the way they always did, but this time they felt distant, like echoes from another room, because the man in front of her had not looked away, had not even acknowledged the explanation, and instead his gaze flickered, subtle but unmistakable, as if he were seeing something beyond what stood before him, something no one else could. And then, without raising his voice, without breaking that quiet intensity, he spoke. "Stop." A single word, calm and absolute, and the entire room obeyed before anyone had time to question it. The words settled into the air with a finality that no one dared challenge, and Emily felt it travel through her chest like a quiet shock, her pulse stuttering as the auctioneer froze mid-motion, his gavel hovering uselessly above the block as if he had forgotten how to bring it down. And for a moment the entire hall existed in that suspended breath, waiting for something to break, for someone to laugh and dismiss the tension. But no one did, because the man standing before her did not repeat. Himself did not need to. And slowly the auctioneer lowered his hand, clearing his throat again, though the sound came out thinner this time, uncertain. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, voice carefully measured. "If you wish to inspect the inventory, we can arrange a more suitable—" "No." The interruption was quiet but immediate, cutting through the words without effort, and Emily's fingers pressed harder against the stone beneath her as she felt the shift again, that strange pull that made her aware of every inch of space between them, every breath that passed through her lungs, and she realized with a flicker of disbelief that he had not looked away from her even once, not since he had stepped into the room, and it made something inside her chest tighten in a way that was not fear, not entirely, something unfamiliar and unsteady that she could not name. And around them the crowd began to murmur, low voices weaving together in confusion and speculation, because this was not how things were done, this was not how choices were made, and yet no one stepped forward to question it. No one dared interrupt the stillness that seemed to belong to him alone. And then he moved again, just one step closer, close enough now that Emily could see the fine details she had missed before, the sharp line of his jaw, the calm steadiness in his expression, the way his presence did not demand attention but commanded it effortlessly. And her breath caught again as her senses sharpened, picking up that same faint scent of pine and winter air, grounding and cold and impossibly clear, and it wrapped around her thoughts until the noise of the room faded further, until it felt like there were only two of them standing there despite the dozens of eyes watching. And she swallowed, her throat tight, forcing herself not to look away this time, because something in his gaze held her there, something that refused to let her retreat into invisibility. And then, without warning, he reached into the inner fold of his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, the soft clink of coins inside breaking the silence in a way that made several heads turn sharply. And before the auctioneer could speak, before anyone could react, he let it fall onto the platform with a controlled, deliberate motion, the pouch landing at the auctioneer's feet with a dull, unmistakable weight, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing across the hall like a statement no one could ignore, and Emily's eyes flickered briefly toward it, her mind struggling to catch up, to understand what she was seeing, what it meant, because no number had been called, no bidding had begun, and yet the message was clear in a way that words could not improve, and the auctioneer stared at the pouch for a heartbeat too long before bending to pick it up, his fingers tightening around it, as if testing its reality. And when he looked back up, his expression had changed. Uncertainty replaced by something closer to awe. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, almost cautiously. "This is more than sufficient." And the murmurs in the crowd grew louder now, no longer contained, because everyone understood what had just happened, even if they did not understand why. And Emily felt the realization settle over her in fragments, disjointed and impossible, as her gaze lifted once more to meet his. And this time there was no doubt in what she saw there, no hesitation, no reconsideration, only a quiet certainty that made her pulse quicken in a way she could not control. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, unhurried, carrying easily through the room without needing to rise. "She comes with me," he said, and the words did not sound like a purchase, did not sound like a transaction, but something else entirely, something deeper, something that made the space around her feel suddenly, impossibly different, as if the path her life had been following had just shifted without warning into something unknown. The words hung in the air long after he spoke them, settling over the crowd like a quiet command that no one could undo. And Emily felt something inside her shift, not fully understanding it, but sensing the weight of what had just happened pressing gently against her chest, as if the world had tilted in a direction she had never prepared for. And the auctioneer nodded quickly now, almost too quickly, his earlier confidence replaced by careful obedience as he stepped forward. "Of course, Your Majesty, she is yours," he said, emphasizing the final word as though trying to make sense of it himself. And a guard moved toward Emily, reaching down as if to pull her to her feet. But before his hand could touch her, the Alpha King lifted his own slightly, a subtle gesture that stopped the motion instantly, and the guard froze, stepping back without a word. And Emily noticed it, that small moment, the way no one was allowed to touch her without his permission, and it sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth through her that she did not know how to process. And for a second she hesitated, unsure what was expected of her, unsure how to exist in this new reality where she was no longer being dismissed or ignored, and the silence stretched just enough for doubt to creep in. But then his gaze returned to hers, steady and unwavering, and something in it grounded her, something that made her push past the uncertainty as she slowly rose to her feet on her own, her legs unsteady at first but holding, because she would not be dragged again, not now, not when everything had already changed. And a ripple moved through the crowd at that simple action, quiet but noticeable, as if they had expected her to falter, to shrink, and instead she stood. And when she lifted her head fully this time, the wooden tag at her neck shifted slightly, the carved words still visible, still defining in their eyes. But for the first time it felt like it belonged to a version of her that was already fading. And the Alpha King studied her for a brief moment, not critically, not dismissively, but as if confirming something only he understood. And then he turned, the motion smooth and deliberate, already beginning to walk back toward the doors without waiting to see if she would follow, as though the outcome had never been in question. And Emily's breath caught at that, the quiet certainty of it. And for a fraction of a second fear returned, sharp and familiar, whispering that she should stay where she was, that this could not be real, that nothing good ever came without a cost. But it was drowned out by something stronger, something that had been building since the moment he stepped into the room, that pull she could not explain. And before she could think too deeply about it, her feet moved, carrying her forward, one step, then another, following the path he had created through the crowd. And as she passed, The people who had ignored her moments before now watched in silence. Their expressions shifted from indifference to something else, something uncertain, and she could feel their attention like a weight on her back, but it no longer pressed her down the same way, because with every step she took, the distance between who she had been in that room and who she was becoming grew wider, and when she reached the edge of the platform she paused. Briefly, glancing once more at the space where she had knelt, at the place that had defined her worth only minutes ago, and then she stepped away from it completely, leaving it behind without looking back again. And ahead of her the doors stood open, lights spilling in from beyond, and the Alpha King had already reached them, his figure outlined against that brightness as he stopped just long enough to glance over his shoulder. Not with impatience, not with demand, but with quiet expectation. And Emily felt it again, that steady pull, guiding her forward into whatever waited on the other side. The light beyond the doors felt different the moment Emily stepped into it, softer yet clearer, as if the air itself carried a sense of space she had not realized she had been missing. And for a second her eyes struggled to adjust after the dim weight of the auction hall, but she did not stop walking, did not let herself hesitate now that she had crossed that invisible line, because something in her knew that turning back was no longer an option, and ahead of her the Alpha King moved with the same steady pace, not fast, not slow, but certain, as though every step had already been decided long before this moment existed. And the corridor stretched wide and silent around them, lined with stone walls that reflected faint traces of light, the echoes of their footsteps the only sound filling the space. And Emily became acutely aware of her own movement, the slight tremor in her hands, the uneven rhythm of her breathing, the lingering disbelief that still had not fully settled into understanding, because none of this made sense, not the way he had chosen her without question, not the way no one had dared interfere, and certainly not the way he had looked at her as though she mattered when she had spent her entire life being told she did not. And her fingers brushed lightly against the wooden tag still hanging at her neck, the edges worn and familiar, and for a moment she considered removing it, considered letting it fall away now that it no longer held the same meaning. But something stopped her, a quiet instinct that told her it was too soon, that she did not yet understand what had changed or why. And ahead the Alpha King slowed slightly, just enough for her to close the distance between them. And when she drew nearer, she could see more clearly now, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his presence remained controlled but not distant, as if he was aware of her in a way that extended beyond simple proximity. And it made her chest tighten again, not with fear, but with something uncertain and fragile. And she realized then that he had not spoken her name, had not asked for it. And yet there was a strange certainty in the way he moved, as though names were unnecessary for whatever reason had brought him into that hall. And the corridor turned ahead, opening into a larger passage where faint daylight filtered in from high windows, casting long lines of brightness across the floor, and Emily stepped into one of those beams without thinking, the warmth brushing against her skin in contrast to the cool air surrounding them, grounding her just enough to steady the swirl of thoughts she could not fully control. And then he stopped, turning slightly so that she stood just within his line of sight, not directly facing her, not confronting, but acknowledging. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not heavy but deliberate, as if it held something waiting to be understood. And Emily swallowed, her voice uncertain as it rose for the first time since leaving the platform. Why me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, quiet but clear in the stillness. And she immediately felt the vulnerability of it, the risk of asking something she might not be ready to hear. But the words had already been spoken, and she held her breath as his gaze shifted toward her again, steady, thoughtful. And for a brief second something flickered there, something she could not quite read, before his expression settled once more into calm certainty. And when he finally answered, his voice was low, even, carrying no hesitation. Because you were the only one who did not disappear. And the words settled into her like a ripple, subtle but undeniable, and she felt them echo through her thoughts, through the quiet spaces she had long since stopped questioning. And for the first time since she had been brought to that hall, Emily did not feel invisible. The words lingered between them, quiet but impossible to ignore, and Emily felt them settle deep beneath her ribs, stirring something she had spent years trying not to feel, because disappearing had never been a choice she consciously made. It had been survival. It had been the only way to exist in a world that had already decided her worth before she ever had the chance to prove otherwise. And yet he spoke as if he had seen through all of that, as if he had watched her in that room, and recognized something no one else had even thought to look for. And her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her sleeve, grounding herself as her thoughts tried to catch up with the moment, because part of her wanted to question him again, wanted to demand something more concrete, something she could understand without feeling like she was stepping into something far beyond her control. But another part of her remained still, listening, waiting, because instinct told her that pressing too hard might shatter whatever fragile clarity existed between them. And the corridor seemed quieter now, the distant echoes fading as if the world itself had stepped back to give space to this moment. And the Alpha King shifted his stance slightly, not moving away, but not closing the distance either, maintaining that careful balance that allowed her to breathe, to think, to remain present without feeling overwhelmed. And she noticed then the way his attention never wavered, not in the way others had stared at her before, not with judgment or expectation, but with a steady awareness that made her feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar and unsettling all at once. And she drew in a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs as she forced herself to hold his gaze a moment longer. "I did not disappear," she said softly, the words forming with more strength than she expected. And for the first time, there was something behind them, something that belonged to her rather than to the labels that had been placed on her. And his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed, a faint acknowledgement, as if he had been waiting for that response. And the corner of his mouth softened just slightly before settling again into calm composure. And he inclined his head a fraction, not in dismissal, but in agreement. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You did not." And something about the way he said it made the truth of it feel real, not like a reassurance, not like an empty attempt to comfort, but like a statement that could not be argued. And Emily felt the tension in her shoulders ease just enough for her to notice it had been there at all. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, the silence returning, but no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. And she realized then that whatever reason had brought him into that hall, whatever had led him to choose her when no one else would, it was not something simple, not something that could be explained in a single sentence or understood in a single moment. And that realization both unsettled and steadied her at the same time, because it meant she did not have to have all the answers yet. She only had to keep moving forward. And as if sensing that shift within her, the Alpha King turned once more, continuing down the corridor with the same measured pace as before. And this time when Emily followed, her steps felt different, still uncertain, still cautious, but no longer hesitant. And as they walked, the space ahead began to open, the corridor widening into a grand entrance lined with tall pillars and distant figures standing at attention, their posture rigid, their expressions carefully neutral as they watched the approach of their king. And Emily felt their attention settle on her as well, sharp and assessing. But she did not lower her gaze this time, did not retreat into herself the way she once would have, because something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable. And as the doors at the far end of the entrance began to open, revealing the vast space beyond, she realized that whatever waited on the other side was no longer something she would face as the girl who had been left behind on a platform, but as someone who had been chosen for a reason she was only beginning to understand. The doors opened wider with a low, steady motion that revealed a vast chamber beyond, and Emily felt her steps slow for just a fraction of a second as the scale of it settled over her. The high vaulted ceilings stretching far above, lined with carved stone that caught the light from tall windows set along the upper walls, and the space itself seemed to hum with a quiet, controlled energy, not loud or chaotic like the auction hall, but measured, deliberate, like every movement within it carried purpose. And as she crossed the threshold behind him, the shift was immediate. The air cooler, clearer, carrying a faint scent of polished wood and something sharper beneath it, something she was beginning to recognize as uniquely his. And along the sides of the chamber figures stood in formal lines, their posture rigid, their eyes forward, but she could feel their attention shift as they noticed her, subtle but unmistakable, a ripple that moved through the room without a single word being spoken. An instinct urged her to lower her gaze, to shrink back into the quiet invisibility that had always kept her safe. But she did not. She held herself steady, her shoulders squared just enough to remain present, because something within her refused to step backward now, not after everything that had already changed, and ahead the Alpha King continued without hesitation, his presence anchoring the space as he moved toward the center of the chamber where a wide platform rose slightly above. The polished floor, not a stage like the one she had left behind, but something more permanent, more symbolic, and when he reached it he stopped, turning to face the room fully for the first time since entering. And the shift was immediate. Every person present straightened further, the quiet deepening into something closer to reverence. And Emily felt it, the weight of his position settling into place around him, not something he forced, but something that existed simply because he did. And for a moment she hesitated at the base of the platform, unsure if she should follow, unsure of where she was meant to stand in a place like this. But before uncertainty could take hold, again, his gaze found hers once more, steady and certain, and he lifted his hand slightly, not commanding, not demanding, but inviting in a way that left no room for doubt. And Emily stepped forward, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly as she joined him, moving to stand just beside him rather than behind. And she felt the difference immediately, the subtle shift in the room, the awareness that she was no longer being observed as something separate or lesser, but as something connected to him. And the realization made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a rising awareness that this moment carried meaning far beyond what she had expected. And the silence held for a breath longer before one of the figures stepped forward from the line, a man dressed in formal attire that marked his position clearly, though his expression remained carefully neutral as he inclined his head. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice controlled. "We were not informed you would be returning with a guest," and the pause was subtle but deliberate, and Emily felt it. The unspoken question beneath the words, the uncertainty that lingered in the room, and for a moment she wondered how he would respond, whether he would explain, justify, or dismiss. But he did none of those things. Instead, his gaze remained forward, his posture unchanged as he spoke, his voice calm, steady, leaving no space for interpretation. "She is not a guest," he said, and the words settled into the chamber with quiet authority. "She is under my protection." And something in the tone made the statement final, unquestionable, and Emily felt it move through her, not just as a declaration to the room, but as something that reached deeper, something that began to rewrite the space she occupied in the world. And as the figures around them lowered their heads in acknowledgement, the uncertainty fading into acceptance, she realized that whatever path she had stepped onto, it was no longer one she walked alone. The acknowledgement rippled outward like a quiet wave, heads lowering in unison, and Emily felt the shift settle into the room with a clarity that left no space for doubt, the kind of acceptance that did not require repetition because it had already been decided. And yet beneath that stillness, she could sense something else lingering, curiosity perhaps, or uncertainty carefully restrained behind disciplined expressions, because while they accepted his word, they did not understand it. And Emily could feel that unspoken question pressing lightly against her presence, not hostile, not openly challenging, but watchful, measuring, waiting. And it made her acutely aware of where she stood, of the space she now occupied beside him, a place she had never imagined for herself, a place that felt both solid and unreal at the same time. And her fingers brushed once more against the wooden tag at her neck, the familiar weight grounding her even as everything else continued to shift around her. And for a brief moment, she wondered if they could still see it the way she had before, if they still saw the carved word as clearly as she did, or if standing here had already begun to change what it meant. And before the thought could settle fully, the man who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his posture respectful but more measured now, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. "Shall we prepare accommodations?" he asked carefully, his tone neutral but edged with quiet precision. And Emily felt the question land in the space between them, practical on the surface but carrying layers beneath it, because accommodations implied distance, separation, a temporary placement. That could be undone, and for a heartbeat the silence returned, not uncertain, but deliberate, and she found herself watching him without realizing it, waiting for his answer in a way that felt instinctive, as if it mattered more than she could yet explain. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty as before. "No," he said, and the words settled firmly, not dismissive but decisive. "She will remain within the inner quarters." And the subtle shift that followed was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, because the inner quarters were not a place offered lightly, not extended without meaning, and Emily felt the weight of that understanding pass through her before she fully grasped its implications, and the man inclined his head again, accepting the instruction without further question, though a flicker of surprise crossed his expression before it was carefully smoothed away, and as he stepped back into place the room seemed to settle once more, the earlier tension dissolving into quiet order, and for a moment Emily simply stood there, absorbing it, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat gradually slowing as the reality of what had been said began to take shape in her mind, because this was no longer a temporary change, no longer a brief interruption in the path she had expected her life to take. This was something else entirely, something that extended beyond the walls of that auction hall and into a future she had not yet imagined. And beside her the Alpha King shifted slightly, his presence grounding in a way that felt both unfamiliar and steady. And without looking directly at her, he spoke again, his voice low enough that it did not carry across the chamber. "You will not be returned." And the words were simple, but they held a finality that settled deep within her, not as a command, not as a warning, but as a truth. And Emily felt her breath catch for just a second before easing again, because for the first time she understood that whatever this was, whatever path she had stepped onto, it was not something she would be sent away from when it became inconvenient. And that realization, quiet as it was, began to reshape something inside her that had been built on the expectation of being left behind. The words remained with her as the chamber slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but something fundamental had already changed, something that could not be undone by silence or routine, and Emily felt it settle into her with a strange clarity, not loud or overwhelming, but steady, like a truth she had always been moving toward without realizing it. And as the figures around them resumed their positions, their attention no longer questioning but accepting, she became aware of the space she now occupied in a way she never had before, not as an absence, not as something overlooked, but as something defined, something anchored beside him. And it was unfamiliar, almost disorienting, because she had spent so long shaping herself around being unseen that standing here, acknowledged without hesitation, felt like learning how to exist all over again. And her hand lifted slightly, almost unconsciously, brushing against the wooden tag at her neck once more, and this time when her fingers traced the carved letters, they did not feel the same. The word no longer carried the same weight, no longer pressed against her identity with the same certainty, and slowly, without drawing attention, she reached up and slipped the cord free, the motion quiet but deliberate as she held the tag in her palm for a brief second, feeling its rough edges, its familiar shape, before letting her hand lower again, not discarding it, not yet, but no longer wearing it as something that defined her place in the world. And beside her the Alpha King shifted slightly, his presence steady as ever, and though he did not look directly at her, she sensed the subtle awareness, the acknowledgement of the small change she had made, and it grounded her in a way she could not fully explain. And the chamber doors behind them closed with a soft, final sound that echoed lightly through the space, sealing off the world she had left behind. And Emily drew in a slow breath, the air filling her lungs as she let it out again, steadier this time, more certain. And she realized then that whatever uncertainty still lingered, whatever questions remained unanswered, they no longer felt like something that would pull her backward, but something that would carry her forward, step by step into a future she had never been allowed to imagine before. And the Alpha King turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the chamber before returning briefly to her, not lingering, not demanding, but present. And in that brief moment, she understood something without needing it to be spoken, that this was not the end of anything, not the resolution of a story that had already been decided, but the beginning of something still unfolding, something that would reveal itself in time rather than all at once. And as he moved again, leading the way deeper into the inner quarters, Emily followed without hesitation, her steps steady, her shoulders no longer bowed. And though the path ahead remained unknown, there was no fear in it now, only a quiet sense of purpose. And somewhere beneath that, something even deeper, something that felt like the first hint of belonging she had ever truly known. And as the light shifted around them and the doors ahead opened once more, she stepped forward into it, not as the girl who had once been left behind, but as someone who had finally been seen.